John, I'd like you to meet Mary. John's the guy I was telling you about who played with Renaissance. Famous British musician.
That is an out you're not about me.
Okay. Anyway, I've been telling people all about how great it was to meet you.
I have a bunch of his this.
Oh, do you really?
Yeah.
You play keyboards, right?
Yeah.
Here he is in Metuchen. It was great. We met the other day and we talked a lot about British rock and roll and Herman's Hermits.
Yeah, good.
The novel that I wrote is called Rip. And I don't know if we were talking a little bit about the Rip Van Winkle story. I'd just like to kind of rehash. The original story was written by Washington Irving, who was probably the first famous author considered to be an American author. I mean, he wrote in the 1700s. He and Edgar Allan Poe, early 1800s, and he and Edgar Allan Poe were the first people identified as American authors. They both lifted a lot of their material from European sources. Edgar Allan Poe, a lot of his stories were based on French detective stories, and Washington Irving lifted a lot of his things from folk tales, especially German, Austrian, Rhine River kind of folk tales, including Rip Van Winkle. There's a European precedent for that, and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow and some of his other stories too. But he wrote them, what made them American was they were set in America. So here he had these stories set along the Hudson River, which he said reminded him very much of the Rhine River, and especially the northern reaches of the river where it becomes more narrow and kind of these towering mountains from the Catskills and then up toward the Adirondacks. He said it was very much like traveling along the Rhine. And he also became very, very enamored of some of the old folk tales that arose in the Catskills and in the Hudson Valley, and especially the early Dutch settlers of that area, New York City, and then further up the Hudson. So I grew up in Yonkers, New York, which is just north of the Bronx, which isn't exactly the Catskills, right? But I became exposed to the Legend of Sleepy Hollow and the Rip Van Winkle story when I was very young, and I just loved it. And somewhere along the line when I got older, I discovered this book that Irving wrote called Dietrich Knickerbocker's History of Old New York. And it's written in this kind of tongue-in-cheek pseudo-history style that he mixes in real people like Peter Stuyvesant and guys like that, or Peter Zenger, who had the first printing press in the New World. But then he makes up people, and he kind of weaves them in, so there's like, Sir Richard the Pegleg, or people that didn't exist that he just weaves into it. This is tongue-in-cheek retelling of the history of early New Netherlands. And so some of the style of that is woven is kind of paying like an homage to Irving's style in those fake histories. And somewhere along the line I got the idea of doing a parody of Rip Van Winkle, and I'm not quite sure why. But I remembered the story, and basically he's this lazy, ne'er-do-well bum who refuses to work. His wife is nagging him, to finally he picks up his musket and takes his trusty dog, heads off to the hills. And while he's off in the mountains, he runs into these strange little men, like they're kind of elves or whatever. And turns out they're the crew of Henry Hudson's ship, the Half Moon, who Henry Hudson discovered the Hudson River, hence the name Hudson River, right? And they give the Rip character, Rip Van Winkle, this strange brew that puts him to sleep. He falls asleep for 20 years, wakes up, and his beard is down to the ground. His dog is gone, presumably dead, and his musket is sitting there all rusted. He doesn't know what happened. Wanders back into the village, and nobody knows who he is. And his wife is dead. He finds that out. He's not all that displeased about that. But then his daughter, it turns out, still lives in the village. She kind of peers behind his beard, looks in his eyes, realizes this is indeed her husband, her father. And he spends the rest of his days sitting outside this tavern, which had been named after the King of England before he wandered off to the hills, and is now called the George Washington Inn. And sits there, he's just like the local town character, telling this fantastic story about what happened to him, and some people kind of believe him, but most people don't. So he's kind of like the local crank sitting outside the bar telling local color, and told, like, don't let anybody tell you there's anything you can't do because you're a girl and or a woman. And Rip's wife, I decided in this parody better be some sort of feminist, or at least be awakening to the idea of feminism, and not be this one-dimensional character portrayed in the original. And so then if I was going to do that, set in the 1960s, I decided like a real parody would be to exaggerate what feminism was like in the early feminist movement, and also exaggerate the worst of male behavior. So the story evolved into a real satire. And the example I give of a satire to show, like there's something in this book to offend everybody if you take it the wrong way. The men are really kind of loutish. All they do is they burp and fart and scratch under their arms and drink beer and argue about baseball and don't work and hang out at the bar, try to avoid work. And the feminists are kind of extreme exaggerations of the kind of parody of what the feminist movement was like in the late 60s and the 70s. And the example I give of why satire does that is Jonathan Swift wrote a thing called An Immodest Proposal back in the day in Great Britain. And the immodest proposal was that there was the Irish problem in England. The Irish people were rebellious, and they were also starving. And I mean, there's still an Irish problem in Great Britain, or in Irish issues related to Britain's control of Northern Ireland. And Jonathan Swift's proposal to solve the problem, the overpopulation problem and the hunger problem, was for Parliament to pass a law allowing every Irish family to eat their firstborn child, right? Which is like as offensive an idea as you can get, but that's what satire does, and he made this point. So mine doesn't have that, but the exaggerations of the feminists and the men is in that tradition. So the story revolves around the Rip character, who I made into a toll collector on the Tappan Zee Bridge, which seemed to be an appropriate job for him. There's a place called Sunnyside on the Hudson River, which was Washington Irving's home. So the bar that these guys hang out with, Rip and his friends, is called the Sunnyside Tavern, and they call themselves the Sleepy Hollow Boys, after the legend of Sleepy Hollow. And the story revolves around battles that erupt between the feminist group and the Sleepy Hollow Boys. The feminist group takes up the cause of Rip's wife, and it begins with them infiltrating this all-male bar, the Sunnyside Tavern, where all these guys hang out. And that's inspired by an episode that happened in New York City in the, I guess it's like in the late 60s, early 70s. There was a bar in the East Village called McSorley's Tavern. That was an all-male bar. Women were not allowed in McSorley's. And there's this famous early episode in the feminism battles that women basically charged into the bar and took over and demanded to be served, and all hell broke loose. But finally, I mean, McSorley's now for 30 years or more has been co-ed, you know. But there's the whole battle, series of battles between the two groups and Rip were inspired by what happened in McSorley's. I went to McSorley's like after this all happened, but I've read about how that was kind of a landmark event in the early days of the women's liberation movement and feminism. So that's all the background. So I mentioned this Dietrich Knickerbocker's History of Old New York and how it makes up these fake characters. So I decided to give you a little flavor of how I kind of did a parody of that pseudo-history. There's a section that talks about the history of the Rip character's family lineage. And in my thing, he's called Van Winkle rather than Van Winkle. And then this kind of also explains why their last name is, why he's a Van Winkle. Twisted and knotted into Rip's DNA strands were traces of many of the founding families of New Netherlands. The Van Blinkels, known for a facial tic inherited by the second son in each generation of Van Blinkels, which tic was always afflicted upon the left eye, so that Van Blinkels walking past you from right to left were instantly recognizable as a Van Blinkle, while Van Blinkles walking from left to right could just as well be a Van der Donk or even a Van Cortlandt. The Van Inkles, printers of Dietrich Knickerbocker's famous History of New York. The Van Minkles, prominent fur traders until they were driven out of business by the old Hudson Bay Company. The Van Rinkles, spelled Rinkles, an old Dutch family known in the old country for spending every waking hour in wintertime skating to and fro on the frozen canals of the Zuider Zee. The Van Schrinkels, early psychiatrists. The Van Sinkles, who earn their living in the plumbing trade. See, I had no pride, I just kind of like went through the alphabet, right? The Van Sprinkles, early weather forecasters. The Van Stinkles, a notoriously smelly lot. Rip's maternal great-grandfather was a Van Stinkle. The Van Thinkles, a clan of prominent but very boring Dutch philosophers. The Van Tinkles, inventors of an early version of the urinal. The Van Twinkles, who always had an annoying twinkle in their eye. And the Van Winkles, whose menfolk were known to worried mothers and wary husbands throughout New Netherlands as shameless flirts and conniving cads. On his mother's side, most significantly, Rip was descended from the Van Drinkles, who opened the colony's first tavern, the Half Moon Tavern, and then proceeded to drink away the profits within a month of Saturday nights. So that, and the Knickerbocker History of New York is written very much in that vein, although like I don't think it had like Van Tinkles inventing urinals, but that was kind of like my tribute to that book. There's two people here, you and you, who are not going to get many of these cultural references in this thing I'm about to read, but maybe you will, I don't know. I thought about him working as a toll collector on the Tappan Zee Bridge, and just got this idea of having this unusual parade of celebrities come through the toll booth. And same thing, like this is almost like stream of consciousness, or like I just been committed to the lunatic assignment. I mean, there's no rhyme or reason to any of these people just popping up. They just popped into my head. But he's a toll collector, and Rip got to see a lot of celebrities, and he kept a handwritten list taped over his cash register. He had collected tolls from singing star Leslie Gore, who was returning to her class reunion at Sarah Lawrence College. She did a song called It's My Party and I'll Cry If I Wanna, right? And she actually went to Sarah Lawrence College in Bronxville. Eternal teenager Dick Clark on New Year's Day and looking slightly hungover. Nixon henchman Henry Kissinger. Comedian Henny Youngman, who passed through the toll booths regularly on his way to and from the Catskills. Roy Rogers and Dale Evans. The late Nelson Rockefeller. Movie star Ali MacGraw, Colonel Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken, sitting in the back of a white stretch limo with a red rooster's crown on the roof. Moe of the Three Stooges. Barbara, I Dream of Jeannie Eden. Polio vaccine inventor Dr. Jonas Salk, sitar master Ravi Shankar. Barbara, I Dream of Jeannie Eden is an old 60s TV show where she played a genie who came out of a bottle and blah, blah, blah. I was living in Massachusetts a while back, and I met this guy who was involved with the Massachusetts Poetry Festival, Michael Ansara Jr. Turns out his father was this actor, Michael Ansara Sr., who played Cochise on television and some other parts. Well, Michael Ansara Sr. divorced Jr.'s first wife and married Barbara Eden, right? So I'm giving a reading, and this guy shows up, and I'm reading this thing, and I suddenly realized, wait a minute, I'm talking about his stepmother, right? And he thought it was funny, so that was good. And most of the celebrities were nice, friendly, down-to-earth people who didn't put on any airs, Rip told his buddies at the Sunnyside Tavern. Some of them were nice enough to offer their autograph in exchange for Rip's generosity, but a few of them refused to pay the toll or tried to rip him off. Kissinger claimed he had quote-unquote diplomatic immunity and wasn't legally required to pay. Rockefeller claimed that he never carried cash. Barbara, I Dream of Jeannie Eden, who was driving a 1964 Mustang convertible and was, quote, wearing a miniskirt up to here, recalled Rip, offered to, quote, grant your fondest wish, end of quote, if Rip would let her through without paying the toll. I was tempted, said Rip, but I said, hey, Jeannie, you know what? If you're in your magic lamp, you don't pay a toll. But if you're in a red Mustang convertible, you fork over the friggin' 50 cents. Mo of the Three Stooges, who was very old and senile, his hair obviously dyed black and badly at that, came to a complete stop, shouted out, hey, knucklehead, look behind you quick, then gunned the engine of his vintage Pierce Arrow Roadster, crashing right through the wooden toll booth barricade and driving off toward the southbound Sawmill River Parkway. More than the splendor of the moon setting over the Tappan Zee, though, more than the moon setting over the Palisades, more than the thrill of meeting interesting people like Moe and Kissinger and Leslie Gore, the most important fringe benefit of the job was this. Rip's toll collection booth was a coin toss away from the comforting confines of the Sunnyside Tavern. The flip side of that, I mean, I've driven over the Tappan Zee Bridge so many times that that it occurred to me like it might be kind of a nice job to have in certain situations. I wondered what it was like to sit there late at night in the toll booth and right by the Hudson River and probably not as much traffic and maybe sit there like listen to music, whatever. So I kind of fantasized what kind of astral projection or something through this character, what he might be thinking if he were me or part of him was me or whatever, just like sitting there on a bridge late at night along the Hudson River, which I've always loved. Rip liked collecting tolls on the Tappan Zee Bridge. The work paid well enough to cover all the essentials, including his monthly tab at the Sunnyside Tavern, but the job had other fringe benefits. From his booth in the far right lane, Rip had a direct view of the water in a southerly direction. During the winter, he watched pale blue chunks of ice drift down the river. In the spring, he could sometimes spot the slick and shiny backs of spawning shad and immense sturgeon. Summer, perhaps the best time of all, brought the pleasure boats, including the yachts owned by the millionaires who lived in the green hills beyond Tarrytown. Come autumn, a vague melancholy drifted over Rip like a soft mist rising from the river up over the bridge's steel towers, and he ached for spring and then summer, pined for the gleaming pleasure boats. But the clear and crisper air of autumn also brought a clear, shimmering view of the river's lower reaches and the startling and stirring sight of Manhattan's skyscrapers, which floated far away in the dewy haze. Sometimes when he worked the night shift, as streams of headlights approached Rip's toll booth, as millions of lights twinkled in distant Manhattan, as the occasional fishing boat, lit with old-time flickering lanterns, passed beneath the bridge. It was as though a galaxy of stars had somehow taken root on the earth. Rip liked these times the best. His portable radio turned to an oldie station out of New York, which mostly played doo-wop from the 50s. Just sitting there in the heated toll booth, gazing at the shimmering skyline of Manhattan or watching the lights of a boat churning through the dark winter river, and some old song by the Penguins, the moon glows, the Orioles or the Five Satins playing softly, a full moon floating over the Palisades cliffs, and Rip wishing that this night would never end. So I kind of got that out of my system too, like the flip side of how nice that might be. And, does anybody remember the TV show Cheers? Right, that was like a big show. I know all those guys who sat at the bar arguing, like the guy who worked at the post office in Norm, right? So another great thing about writing fiction is like you can kind of do whatever you want, right? And I don't know how many of you are familiar at all with Westchester County, New York, but there's a town called Mount Vernon, a town called White Plains, right? The county is Westchester. So I have these three characters who are friends of Rip. One guy's named Westchester, right? The other guy named Whitey Plains, right? And Monty Vernon, right? And Westchester and Monty Vernon are kind of inspired by the guys who sit at the bar and Cheers. And the story takes place on July 20th, 1969. And I don't know if that means anything to anyone. It's the day that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, right? So these two guys, Westchester and Monty Vernon, pop up through the story for kind of comic relief, and they're arguing about whether the moon landing actually could possibly happened, right? So this is like the first time they show up. Wes and Monty were deep into a friendly debate, which swerved as it evolved into the realms of chemistry, biology, astronomy, physics, metaphysics, ethics, and even statistics and probability, over whether the men who were now walking on the moon, assuming they had brought along some beer, would be able to drink more beer or less beer than they would be able to drink on Earth. Wes Chester, a pragmatist, argued that the size of an astronaut's stomach and the capacity of his bladder would be unchanged despite the lower gravity on the moon. Ergo, the capacity to drink and retain beer would not be any different on the lunar surface. Monty Vernon, more of a dreamer and more optimistic, contended that the lower gravity would expand the body's organs, creating more room for a few extra brews, and that the astronauts' bodies actually weighed less than they did on Earth, which meant they could carry around a little more beer to balance out the reduction in their physical mass. Monty also speculated that the astronauts' blood, thinned by the lack of atmosphere, would be able to absorb more alcohol, thus increasing the amount of beer an astronaut could consume. As Mrs. Van Winkle, this is the point where Van Winkle's wife shows up, storming into the bar like he's there again, and she's like there to drag him out by his collar. As Mrs. Van Winkle makes her surprise appearance on the sidewalk outside the Sunnyside, Wes and Monty were about to embark down a rhetorical side alley, debating whether the moonwalking astronauts, upon their return to terra firma, would A, be drunk, B, have big beer guts, or C, be ready and raring to get back on that rocket ship and head back to that good old moon where they could drink beer to their heart's content. What I was saying about the Sorley's Tavern and his exaggerated portrayal of feminists, this is kind of like the first pivotal scene in the book when the Sunnyside Tavern gets infiltrated by kind of a forward guard of this feminist army that ends up going to battle for the Rip character's wife. It had all begun with a sneak attack. Wes Chester and Monty Vernon had been sitting at their usual place near the front door, arguing over whether there was any chance that the Russians might land cosmonauts on the dark side of the moon just before the Apollo astronauts landed on the bright side of the moon. Sal McGundy, the owner, was about to interrupt their discussion by interjecting the interesting notion that maybe the astronauts would find out that the moon really was made of cheese and would sink right down through the lunar surface and come out on the other side all covered with Limburger. Just then a small man, wearing slacks and a shirt, work boots, sunglasses, and an oversized baseball cap pulled down to just above the ears, strolled into the Sunnyside, took a quick look around, and took a seat at the bar. "Can I help you, pal?" Sal McGundy asked from behind the bar. In a soft voice, nearly a whisper. In retrospect, Sal McGundy later said, "I should have realized something was up. The guy sounded just like Jackie Kennedy Onassis." The stranger replied, who had this kind of soft, whispery voice, if you've ever heard her. The stranger replied, "I'd like a white wine cooler." Sal McGundy scratched his head and rubbed his chin. "There's 3 drinks on the menu," he liked to tell newcomers, purposely neglecting to mention the watered-down booze he stocked only grudgingly on the Sunnyside shelves. "We have beer, beer, and beer." More exactly, the Sunnyside's taps spewed out what Sal McGundy and the Sleepy Hollow boys were wont to refer to as, quote, good old American beer. Rheingold was the favorite, followed by Ballantine, although there were a few younger guys who drank Schlitz or Pabst Blue Ribbon. Ask for a Heineken or a Molson or even a Guinness Stout at the Sunnyside, and you were immediately labeled as a kook. Ask for a slow gin fizz, and you were instantly pegged as a troublemaker. Order a white wine cooler, and there was no doubt that you were a pinko, atheist, draft dodger. And yank off your baseball cap with a dramatic sweep of your arms so that your long hair came tumbling down to your shoulders, and ask Sal McGundy, "Can a girl get a drink around here?" And you were immediately labeled as a female, a chick, a broad, and in the hallowed haven of the Sleepy Hollow boys, as Sal explained later in an interview with Dick Cavett, you were, quote, as welcome as a maggot in a bag of rice in China. The The customer who sounded like Jackie Kennedy Onassis was not Jackie Kennedy Onassis. She was Lilith B. Anthony, great-granddaughter of the late great suffragist Susan B. Anthony, and a professor of women's studies at Vassar College, located upstream in Poughkeepsie. In addition to her full course-load at Vassar, teaching 5 courses, including Sappho Agonistes, Alone on Prom Night, The Lighter Side of Gertrude Stein, Feminism at the Movies, No Longer Tied to the Railroad Tracks, Fear of Dying, Quest for Eternal Life in the works of Mary Shelley and Erica Jong, and The American Revolution, Why Don't We Ever Hear Anything About the Founding Mothers, she had found time to become involved in the Breastfeeders Revolutionary Army, BRA, B-R-A, which had started out as an effort to end prejudice against women who nursed their children in public, but had branched out to attack all forms of oppression of women in the male-dominated society. She had considered changing their name to the Breast Liberation Army, but realized that that made BRA become BLA, and so decided to retain their original name despite their refocused mission. While most of their work was done quietly, to stay in the public eye and get media attention for their causes, BRA members did 2 things. They burned their bras at public rallies and infiltrated all male bastions like McSorley's in Lower Manhattan, which had been successfully opened to women after decades as a male-only enclave, and the Sunnyside Tavern, which proved a more formidable challenge. I'm going to read one more bit of it. This is toward the end. This whole series of battles break out between the feminists and the Sleepy Hollow Boys, including things like where they actually engage in warfare, where the feminists are using their bras, which they don't wear. They use them as kind of like these catapults to hurl rocks at the Sunnyside Tavern, and then the Sleepy Hollow Boys respond by doing that with jock straps. So you kind of get an idea, right? But so it kind of comes to this resolution where Rip's wife has an awareness of the fact that she's not happy with the state of affairs and she's going to do something about it, but she still loves her husband. And he comes across her, he doesn't get it. He still doesn't get it. But there's this kind of like vague melancholy like this. He knows like something wrong, there's something that he needs to fix, but he doesn't quite get it either, which seems to me like that was kind of typical of what happened in those early, or even now, as feminism has evolved, it's evolved to the point where men can say that they're feminists, and so people have gotten this whole concept of what feminism means. But I think like early on when people felt threatened by, especially men felt threatened by feminism, they didn't get like what it really meant, and he kind of knew like there was something. So my character kind of knows that there's something wrong with his behavior. He loves his wife. He's just kind of like this goofball who just doesn't understand even after all this happens, and he has this kind of vague awareness that he didn't have before, but still doesn't quite know what to do about it. So it all kind of ends with that. But I didn't want the ending to be all cut and dry. But this is toward the end, and it kind of sums up the tone toward the end. Westchester and Monty Vernon are back there at the bar. Wes and Monty return to their stools near the front door, where they continue to watch the goings-on in the streets of Tarrytown and continue to argue about the moon landing. As we leave them, Monty has just suggested that on a clear, crisp, cloudless night, since the moon supposedly has no atmosphere to blur the view, people on Earth should be able to see those stiffly standing American flags that the astronauts supposedly left on the lunar surface. This being true, and since no one on the Earth's surface has ever been able to actually see the American flags planted on the moon, Monty offers this as final, irrefutable proof that the moon landing was actually filmed on a Hollywood soundstage. But Wes, while he agrees that the Apollo landings were faked, argues that it is impossible for the naked eye to see objects on the surface of the moon because, as he tells Monty, quote, "It's too friggin' far away, you dope. Just look at it. It's gotta be at least a couple of 100 miles away." Monty contemplates this theorem as the front door of the Sunnyside Tavern swings shut, and we buy one more round of good old Budweiser and bid farewell to the Sleepy Hollow boys. As for Rip, as the argument between Monty Vernon and Westchester continues, he slips out the back door of the Sunnyside Tavern. He gets into one of the boats still kept docked on the Hudson River shore just below the Sunnyside, and paddles silently upriver toward the Tappan Zee Bridge. He pulls up under the bridge, directly in the middle of the river, and he sits on one of the stone abutments, where he sips from a bottle of Bud and chews pensively on an extra spicy Slim Jim. Ripples of water wash over Rip's long, thin feet, but he doesn't even notice, for nothing can distract him from the ache of his own broken heart that his wife has left him, and he just doesn't know why. So he's sitting there drinking a Budweiser under the Tappan Zee Bridge, chewing on a Slim Jim. Right? So anyway, that's it. That gives you the Thanks for coming. And we have books if anybody would like to get one, and I'd be happy to sign them if you get one. Okay, thank you all very much.